Hello, folks, and welcome to the Two Stewards Show. My name's Mark, and I'm here with Brent, my co-host.
Hi, Mark.
And today we have an extra special guest on. We have Vijay Boyapati, and Vijay is probably most well known in the Bitcoin world, anyways, for his long form essay, I guess, turned into a book, which is got on the screen here if you're watching, The Bullish Case for Bitcoin. And it's been kind of a seminal work for a lot of people getting into Bitcoin. It's not a huge, long book, but it covers, I don't know, it covers everything pretty well. And sorry, when was it released, Vijay?
It was published in 2021.
2021. Okay, so it's actually a couple years old, but still, still very timely information in there, right? As you go through the book. So, for anybody watching, if you are getting into Bitcoin and you want to read a concise summary of what it's about and why you should have it, we really recommend this book, both Brent and I think we've referenced it in past podcasts as well. So,
welcome to the show, Vijay.
Oh,
thanks for having me, guys. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Sorry, I got excited.
Just pitching his book the whole time. This would be good. This would be good for him.
What's the affiliate link?
Yeah, we'll get it all done out.
No, just kidding. So Vijay, as we established earlier off the air, you are originally Australian. You're now in the States, right?
That's correct. Yeah, I live in Seattle, Washington.
Oh, okay. So we just we had another guest who's from where is he from? Portland, I guess. Portland area. So maybe not that close, but I got family out that way and it was about an hour from Seattle. And that's not relevant at all, but no, that's cool. So you I don't know, maybe we can just go through a little bit of your history, Vijay, to understand kind of where you're coming from. So you were born in Australia. Where was it? Perth? Is that what you guys were saying earlier?
No, we're talking about Brent's family, but I was born in Melbourne.
Okay.
I was born in Melbourne, but I grew up in Canberra, which is our capital. It's kind of like our DC, and spent most of my early life there. Went to university in Canberra, got a degree in science, Bachelor of Science, focusing on computer science and mathematics, and then I came over to the US to do a PhD in computer science. And I was going to go to either Carnegie Mellon or MIT and do PhD in machine learning. But I got a job offer and I eventually ended up at Google when it was, still a startup. And really got to have a front row seat on technology history, being at a company that started small and has completely changed the world, and went from being a small company to being a just gargantuan company now, one of the biggest on earth. So my background is in technology. I'm a computer scientist by training, and came over here to study, and I've been here ever since and settled down in Seattle. Married an American, have 4 little American kids. So yeah, that's how I got over here.
So you left Google now, like you're no longer working.
Yeah, I actually left Google back quite a long time ago in 2007. And the reason I left was I got really excited by one of the candidates in the presidential election. And he came to Google to give a talk. And I was so excited that I quit my job and decided to go campaign for him. And maybe not so well known now, but he was, a lot of people were excited about him then. It was Ron Paul. Uh-huh. And he was talking about ideas that no one else had ever talked about. The fact that the US really should not be intervening in global politics and invading other countries like Iraq. He talked about the importance of sound money and the negative effect that the Federal Reserve and other central banks have on economies around the world. He was talking about these ideas which had never made it into the mainstream politics. And I was so excited that he was getting a platform that I left my job. I helped raise a few $1 million for him, went to New Hampshire and campaigned, spent like a year campaigning in various states and brought a lot of people there to knock on doors and tell people about Ron Paul. But ultimately it didn't work out, and I ended up going back into the technology world.
So
Interesting.
Yeah, so Ron, I mean, like, he's a folk hero, right? Ron Paul, sort of in the libertarian space, I would say.
Yeah.
And now Rand Paul. But was this your first kind of exposure to this way of thinking or these ideas? Did you have any of those leanings beforehand, before you heard them, or was it just like, whoa, blown away?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Actually, just a few years before I came across Ron Paul, I had met some libertarians at Google, and they had introduced me to sort of the libertarian school of thought that I'd never been exposed to in Australia. I didn't know it existed. I thought there was liberal and conservative, and that was it. And then I was exposed to this other sort of way of thinking about the world. And I remember a friend of mine at Google lent me a VHS tape of Ayn Rand being interviewed by Phil Donahue in the 1970s. And the feeling, I still remember it. I felt like I'd been hit by a bolt of lightning. No one had ever spoken this way. And it was this small Russian woman sitting in front of a very hostile audience, giving very calm, logical answers to questions that most people wouldn't be able to think about it in that way. And I just remember thinking there's something to this. There's something to this way of thinking about the world, that individuals have value and they should be protected, and individual rights are really important. And so I had some exposure, and then I came across Ron Paul, and I thought, politicians, after I'd been exposed to libertarianism, politicians just want power, and they usually don't have much principle. And then I heard Ron Paul in the first Republican debate, and he explained some of the causes of 9/11 and the US foreign policy and how that connects to people's view of the US overseas. And it made complete sense. And he was castigated by Rudy Giuliani, and the crowd booed him. But he had the courage of his conviction, and he held to his principle, and he stood there and he explained it while the audience was booing him. And I thought, who is this guy? Who is able to stand up in front of a huge audience baying for his blood and tell them the truth? And so I was inspired, and I wanted to do everything I could to help him out. And so I quit my job, very well-paying job at Google, left a lot of stock on the table, Google shares, and spent a year working on that. And I got to see the US political process up front and up close. And it's honestly very dejecting when you realize how the political process works, how the sausage is made. It's not what you expect. And you realize that grassroots activism actually has a lot less influence than these big, powerful interests like the media. Like, Fox News excluded Ron Paul from the debate, which destroyed his chance of being nominated to the Republican Party as their presidential candidate. And I realized, hey, all of this effort I put in, all the millions of dollars I raised, didn't matter as much as one decision from Fox News. So it was really a dejecting experience for a few years. But the good thing is, a few years later, I felt like I came across something, Bitcoin, that could achieve the same thing, not through the political process, but through technology and through decentralization, which I still find really inspiring, and I think helps push forward the same ideas that Ron Paul was really championing in 2007.
So have you had any subsequent involvement in politics?
I have not. I remain.
Haven't you seen his name up for president this year?
No, but even helping campaign. No, it's
yeah.
It's,
I have gotten a little bit more involved in local state politics, in Washington State, but in general, I have stayed away from political activism.
Is that because you're jaded with politics, or?
I think so. I think I've learned that the political process is really, it's both messy and it's vicious. It's really vicious. I think people treat each other so poorly, and they lose sight of the humanity of their opponents and treat them as if they are enemies, and that they are acting in bad faith. You can come to different views of the world from, good faith positions. And I think it's just harder to get there when you're dealing with politics. If you're dealing with, say, Bitcoin, for instance, what I've found is that there are people who have very different views of the world who come together because of their appreciation of Bitcoin. People from very different backgrounds. Like you guys are in real estate. I've had people who are really into like the raw milk movement, which is like a big movement in the US. Then there are like doctors and lawyers who are just looking for a way to keep their savings safe from inflation, retirees, just so many different backgrounds. And that's the thing that I find really exciting, is that people have this common interest, even though their political beliefs are different or their backgrounds are different. That doesn't matter. And I feel like that's much more inspiring than the political process, where you just assume that people who have different opinions are evil in some way, which is just, I think, really not healthy.
So you walk us through. So you came to do your doctorate. You ended up working for Google. You left Google, did the political thing for Ron Paul for a while, and then was that before Bitcoin was invented?
Yes.
Like, what's the timeline here? Like, how did you stumble into Bitcoin after this?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Because
the Ron Paul's campaign ended in 2008. Then I did some startup work for a little while. I had a startup with a friend of mine from Google. Unfortunately didn't end up going anywhere. Funny thing is, we were part of this incubator in Silicon Valley, very well-known incubator called Y Combinator. And we were doing a startup in a space which really didn't go anywhere. It was called Daily Deals, like Groupon and Living Social. And we built a search engine over that. But right around that time, Bitcoin had sort of come onto the scene, and my friend was like, why don't we build a Bitcoin startup to make it easy for people to buy Bitcoin? And I was really worried about the regulatory risks of doing that. And he basically was pitching me Coinbase, like building Coinbase. And Coinbase went through that same incubator as us just a year later. And so he was pitching me Coinbase a year before Coinbase started. And I was like, I don't know, I think this is too risky. And he likes to send me that email periodically and show me like what I said about it. But that wasn't when I came across Bitcoin. I came across Bitcoin about a year before that. And I had a bet with a friend of mine about Federal Reserve policy, because I'm kind of an economics nerd. And I won the bet, and the bet was for a single silver coin. And at the time, that silver coin was worth about $50. And my friend said, don't take the silver coin. There's this other thing that I've learned about. It's this new money on the internet. It's called Bitcoin. Had no idea what he was talking about. And he asked me to download some software on my laptop, and my laptop started getting really hot because it was downloading the blockchain and verifying transactions. I didn't know what was going on. I'm like, what's going on with my laptop? And then he showed me how to create an address, and then he sent me 5 Bitcoins, which was the same value as the silver coin that he owed me. And he showed me on a block explorer. He said, look, I sent you 5 Bitcoins, and it was just numbers and letters. I had no idea what any of it meant. And I basically just forgot about it. And funny thing is, I eventually gave that laptop to my ex-girlfriend when we broke up. And she took it, and then, several years later in 2017, I realized that laptop was worth a lot. I was like, wow, that laptop's worth $10,000. It's worth $20,000. It's worth $100,000. and then I emailed her and I said, do you still have that laptop, by the way? And she said she had lost it, she had lost it in a hotel in Minnesota. And I believe her, because you can look at those 5 Bitcoins and they have never moved. They're stuck in the same spot. So those Bitcoins are dead. And so the supply of Bitcoin is not 21 million. It's 21 million minus at least 5 Bitcoins. My Bitcoin, which you can...
I'm sure you're not the only one.
Yeah, exactly. So you guys can consider that a donation to the Bitcoin community.
Thank you. Well, I mean, arguably, there's millions of Bitcoin that are lost, right? From the similar stories from the early days when people didn't know, and there's just really no way to get them back. But I mean, that's the part of the nature of Bitcoin, right? There's no backstop. There's no Federal Reserve saying, it's okay, guys, we got you. You know?
Totally right. It's like if you lost the keys to your car and your car disappeared from the universe. And most people don't have a good mental model for that. And so in the early days when people didn't understand what this was or how valuable it could be, they just didn't pay close attention to their private key management and storage. And so a lot of people lost a lot of Bitcoin. And I think it's estimated that it's over 3 million Bitcoins have been lost. So it's quite significant.
Yeah, that makes for good news headlines too. Like, oh, you could lose this stuff. Okay, so that's how you got into this experience. You lost your laptop, and you'll never do that again.
I hope not.
But then, how do you go into writing a book like this? Believing in it, right? Because I guess at that point, you thought it was interesting and poking around. You got 5 Bitcoins on a laptop, but you're not obviously treating it with respect like you would now. What changed in between there?
Yeah, so when I was exposed to libertarianism at Google, I was also exposed to Austrian economics, this school of economic thought that goes back over a century and sort of tries to explain economic phenomena based on human motivations. And I think it's the correct method for understanding economic phenomena. So I was really a student of economics before I knew anything about Bitcoin. And I was something of a gold bug, actually. Perhaps it's my Indian heritage. But also, I think I was also worried about inflation a lot earlier than most other people were. And I really wanted to understand the question, why does gold have any value? It's this rock, and it doesn't do anything. It's not really useful for anything. I mean, now you can use it for a few things, right? You can use it for dental implants, and you can use it in circuitry. But that's not really where gold gets its value. Most of gold's value comes from the fact that it's been used as money for thousands of years. Most gold, the vast majority of gold stock does nothing. It sits in vaults just gathering dust. And so I remember reading Warren Buffett saying how gold was really useless and how if an alien species came down to Earth and saw us digging up gold from one location, then putting it in a hole in another location, they'd be wondering, what the hell is going on here? These people are completely crazy. But yet, gold was worth trillions of dollars. So how is that possible? How do we get there from this argument on one side that gold is useless to this obvious reality that it has trillions of dollars of value? So I was obsessed with this question for a few years. And when I came across Bitcoin, I immediately realized, hey, this is a new monetary good. This is like gold in a lot of ways, except it's better than gold. It's like gold with teleportation built in. Whereas it's really hard for me to send gold. If I wanted to send you guys a gold coin, man, I'd have to go to the post office. I'd have to put in a packet. I'd have to insure it. It would take days or, longer to get to you, go through customs. There's risk that it gets stolen. It's a pain. But if I wanted to send you Bitcoin, I could do it as easily as sending an email. So I recognized, hey, this is gold with wings. And once I realized that, I got super excited about it. And I wanted to understand, how does this thing have value? And it was a very similar question to why does gold have value? And I spent really years after I discovered Bitcoin thinking about this. And I would say around 2014, when I did my first interview about why Bitcoin has value, I had figured this out. And I had these ideas that are in the book in my head since at least 2013 or 14. And then when 2017 came around, I started getting a lot of questions from friends and family about Bitcoin. Like, hey, tell me about this Bitcoin thing. You've been interested in it for a long time. Should I put some money in it? Why should I put some money in it? And I thought I should, come up with an explanation that I can share with friends and family, that I can just pass around an article and say, look, this is why I'm interested in Bitcoin. This is why I think it has value. And so I put together an article, and I hoped it would be read by my mother and maybe a few friends and family. And really,
Mark and Brent.
Yeah, Mark and Brent, but it blew up, and it's been read over 1 million times. It's been translated into over 20 languages by volunteers. I didn't pay to do any of that. They just kind of picked it up and said, hey, this is important. I want to translate it. And it really blew me away. It was a very humbling experience to write something. Every author just wants their stuff to be read. That's the only thing they care about. And to have it read is very humbling. And to meet people who've read it and to hear them say, hey, this helped me understand Bitcoin is extremely gratifying. So, it really started as me trying to explain to people close to me why I was excited about Bitcoin, and it resonated. And I think the reason it resonated was there's this really big latent desire in the wider population to understand this thing. They keep hearing about it. People keep hearing about it on the news, and sometimes in bad ways, like there was some big hack or people lost a lot of Bitcoin. It comes up in kind of a negative connotation, or is being used to buy drugs. But eventually they get interested in it and they think, hey, I've seen the price go up a lot, and I've seen it on these financial networks like CNBC. How do I understand it? And it's because of that latent desire to try and understand it that I think the article resonated so much, and why I think the book did so well.
So, yeah, interesting. I'm sorry, my wheels are turning a little bit. Just thinking about U.S. politics, and I mean, you tell me what you think of this, right? I think U.S. politics is inextricably tied to the U.S. dollar, because the dollar being reserve currency of the world. There are so many people who are very interested in what happens in U.S. politics and have influence. So many different lobbies, and I mean, I don't know what the spending is for presidential races, but it's got to be it's at least in the hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, which is we're
It's
Canadian.
definitely billions. Yep.
Yeah. Billions. I don't know. That's probably our gross domestic product in Canada. Once you figure in the exchange rate. But, in your experience, it's kind of a juggernaut, and there's two, my view is there's two parties, but really it's two sides of one coin, very similar. And the people that come up, for election generally are not there by merit, right? Most of them, if you're cynical, you'd say they're placed there by interest groups. And so going that route, you really don't have a chance to change the system. But then looking at Bitcoin, this is grassroots. And I mean, the market cap of Bitcoin is still much less than that of gold, never mind the US dollar. But, is this the way we can make meaningful change in society as well, by changing the money? Or is that a little far-fetched, do you think?
No, I really agree with that. I think that's really true. And I think you can change society through technology. And I think we've seen that over and over again, even not just over the last few centuries, but I think really profoundly over the last 20 years, that you can bring in technology that reshapes the world. The internet really was, a watershed moment in terms of freedom of communication, and people not getting information through these very powerful filtered channels like the mainstream media. And the internet's not perfect, of course, but you guys probably remember a time when it was hard to get alternative points of view. When I was growing up, I mean, I got all of my information from, how many TV stations did we have in Australia? I think 4 or 5. And they all basically had the same point of view, right? But to get these kind of crazy out there points of view, and some of them are literally crazy, but some of them are crazy, but because they're exposing a truth that no one wants to talk about. So the internet really gave us freedom of information, freedom of communication. What Bitcoin gives us is freedom to transact, the ability to transact with people without government supervision or censorship. And there are many examples where governments, maybe not so much in the West, although even in Canada, right? People who were protesting, the truck drivers, found it hard to raise money on regular platforms like PayPal. They were shut down. But Bitcoin gave them a way to raise money and to transact with people who said, hey, look, we support you guys, and we support your ability to protest for things that you believe in. And so I think that's profoundly transforming, to have a world where people across the globe can transact with each other without any permission from governments. It's a new world. I think it'll be every bit as transformative and powerful, even from a political sense, as the internet was. And in some ways, I think it's, from my libertarian perspective, I think it's really hopeful, right? Because if everyone eventually adopts Bitcoin as money, as I think will happen, it puts a big constraint on governments, because the way governments raise money to do what they want, to fight wars and to spend money like crazy on boondoggles, is through inflation. Governments inflate the money supply, which is a way of taxing the population without the population understanding, and then transferring that wealth to people who are well connected politically, which is like, honestly, that's a bullshit system. That's not a fair system, that people who are politically well connected benefit at the expense of people who are not, like retirees who have very little political power. Why should banks and military companies get to feed at the government spigot when the average person gets, more and more expensive food through inflation? Not fair at all. And so for me as a libertarian, the real hope here is that Bitcoin puts a constraint on the way governments work and the way they distribute wealth to people who are politically connected, and especially to reduce their ability to fund warfare. Because since central banking was invented by the Bank of England, what have central banks really been about? They've been about funding wars. That's why they came about, to make it more efficient for governments to fund wars. And if that is harder to do, I think that's a better world. So I see Bitcoin as a way of achieving political transformation, which is really beneficial to everybody on Earth, not through the political process, but through technology.
So I would tend to agree. I think Mark would agree. But what I want to hear from you is kind of how that works. Because I think a lot of our listeners are maybe in the early days of understanding Bitcoin, even what it is, how it works. Could you kind of give us a little bit of a taste for, okay, what problem did Bitcoin, like what makes it such a revolutionary thing like the internet was, right? Like for people who have never heard of it, okay, they can see the internet made sense. Okay, that really changed communication. That changed, now we have email. It's just taken for granted. Everyone on the planet's got a phone. But what is it about Bitcoin? Maybe, I don't know how technical you want to get, but just kind of for listeners who might not have thought about this before.
Yeah, well, I'll take it from the value first rather than the technology. I think there are two twin pillars to Bitcoin's value proposition. One is that you can keep your savings in an asset that cannot be debased, and that has absolutely fixed supply. This has never been possible before in human history. Even gold inflates over time because people find more gold and dig it out of the ground, and the gold supply inflates by 2% per year. With Bitcoin, you can keep your savings in an asset that will never be, more than 21 million Bitcoin. So if you have some fraction of the total supply, that as adoption grows, and we can talk about why adoption grows, but as adoption grows, your fraction of the total wealth can never be debased. Now, that's a very, very attractive selling point for Bitcoin. The other pillar of Bitcoin's value proposition is that you can keep and transmit your savings without anyone's permission. So 1, you can keep your savings free from debasement, and 2, you can do with your savings what you see fit. You can send it to someone without anyone's permission. You can keep it yourself. You can cross a border with all of your savings and no one will know. And maybe that's not so important to people in Canada or the US right now, but imagine you live in Venezuela, or imagine you live in a part of Africa which is incredibly violent, like the Sudan, and you've accumulated savings over time, and crossing a border is scary because at the checkpoint, they want to know, what do you have on you? Do you have any gold on you? Do you have any other assets that we can take? When I was a kid, I'll tell a brief story. My mum got sick and she had a brain tumor, which she thankfully recovered from. And my dad got really scared and he wanted to move back to India because that's where he had grown up. And so he sold all of his assets and he converted them to gold. And he got on a plane with his kids, me and my sister, and held his gold in a bag, physical bag, because at the time, India did not have a functioning banking system. You couldn't just transfer your money over. And he flew to India with a bag of gold. And I remember the fear during that process, carrying all of his wealth in a bag, going through customs in India, which is incredibly corrupt, and the fear that everything he'd ever earned could be taken away. With Bitcoin, you don't have that problem. You can cross a border with all of your wealth. You can make a new life for yourself, and no one can stop you. And one more example I think of is the Jews in Europe during World War II. Many of them were able to escape to the US and to Canada, but a very large fraction of them escaped with nothing, because it's really hard to move a continent and move your life and carry everything. With Bitcoin, you have the freedom and the ability to take your wealth anywhere you want. That's incredibly powerful freedom, and it really puts a constraint on governments, because if you can't get at people's wealth, then that reduces your power a lot more. So for me as a libertarian, I'm really about freedom promoting technologies and politics where possible, but anything that can improve human freedom and allow people to keep the fruits of their labor safe and under their own control. And that's what Bitcoin really gives you. And we can talk about the technology and how that's possible and decentralization. But to me, those are the pillars of the value proposition, that you can do those things.
That's where my mind goes next. Like I can see the value, and those stories I think ring true. Like it's very important for people to be able to move their wealth without being interrupted.
Well,
but
I mean, okay, let me play devil's advocate a little bit here. Like, is it? Like, who cares? We live. Okay, so I've been.
I want to get to the technical side of things, Mark. But we'll talk about this.
I know.
All right.
I think that's a great question.
It's all related.
Who cares is the exact right question. It's the question I was trying to answer. Who cares? When my friends and family were asking me about it, like, why should you care? I think it's a great question.
Yeah, because I mean, a lot of people will tell you, or economists, anyways, economists will tell you that like central banking is an incredible invention. So I like history and listened to some stuff about, the French Revolution. So 1790 thereabouts, the French government went bankrupt, right? They eventually were like, we got no more money, guys. We have to pay everybody in IOUs. And, there was money around, but because they were relying on private bankers and, their profligate spending, corruption, everything else, eventually they ran out of money. And this is one of the causes of the French Revolution. And so the government was overturned. And I mean, there's countless examples of this where monarchs went broke or became beholden to private moneylenders. Once central banking was introduced, governments don't have to worry about that anymore because they can control the amount of currency that they have. And like, is that not a better thing? And doesn't that lead to more stability in the world where you don't have to worry about a situation where you'll have a whole group of people who need to escape from a country or a continent?
Mark asked me this question and I couldn't answer it. So
I'm setting VJ up a little bit, but I mean, this is what some of the reasoning you get out there, right? Like, especially modern monetary theory.
Let me address it with a few points. Governments, monarchies did go bankrupt because they didn't have an easy way to get the savings of the population through inflation. And so what central banking did is it gave nation states the ability to not go bankrupt. You can say that's a good thing from the perspective of the nation state, who can extract savings now in this way of inflating the money supply, but is it good for the population? Like, there's a difference to me between the monarch going bankrupt and necessarily the population going bankrupt. The French monarch went bankrupt because the profligate spending that they had was they funded the US Revolution, which is kind of ironic. and they were trying to undermine the British, so they funded the US Revolution and they ran out of money. Now, if they had, central banking, then they could have extracted even more money out of the French population and impoverished them even more. Instead, what happened was they went bankrupt. The French population realized they were bankrupt and overthrew them. So, you can argue actually in a way that this was a positive development. I will say one other comment is that the United States economy during the 19th century went through the biggest expansion in human history, and more people were lifted out of poverty than at any period of time. Like the standard of living, the rate, and you can measure this by various things like, average lifespan, infant mortality. There's a whole bunch of things. The 19th century was a very profound period for increasing people's standard of living in the United States. That was a period when the US did not have central banking. And so, people can say, hey, central banking is a great invention. Well, look at the 19th century. The US thrived during that period. And in a way, it was kind of chaotic. There were booms and busts. But capitalism is not this, pure process where people go from having no wealth to having a lot of wealth, and there's not disruption. There's a lot of disruption in capitalism. Like the horse and buggy industry was completely blown away, and there were a lot of people who had a lot of jobs who lost their jobs. But capitalism moves us forward. It makes us all wealthier, and it can be turbulent, but it's possible to have capitalism without central banking. It is a fallacy that you need central banking. And the reason we got central banking really was because a bunch of bankers got together and said, hey, this would be good for us. Let's create a cartel. And they did. They created a cartel in 1913, and they really solidified it, and they really demolished the gold standard during the Great Depression. And the reason they gave was, hey, the gold standard puts too many constraints on us. It's true in a sense. The gold standard put constraints on their ability to spend on war, and governments spent way too much money during World War I, and so they had accumulated these huge debts that they couldn't pay off. And the gold standard said, you're bankrupt. You don't have enough money, and you have to basically reduce your spending. And instead of facing reality, they said, hey, let's get rid of the gold standard. Let's create a new system that makes it easy for us to spend without limit by taxing the population insidiously. I think that's a bad thing. And I think we should go back to a world that's similar to the gold standard, with honest money, where people who have savings can feel safe that their savings will not be inflated away, and that when you go to the grocery store, it's not going to be twice as expensive next year. I mean, I don't know about you guys in Canada, but we've had a pretty big inflation in the US over the last 2 or 3 years. And, I used to be able to go to Costco and buy a brisket for like $40 or $50. Now it's around $100.
Wow.
So I want the ability to keep my savings and have their value continue through time without inflation. And that's what a Bitcoin standard would give us.
There you go, Mark. It's a fallacy. It's insidious and it's unsafe. And no more asking that question.
What are the chances we get there? Right? We look at the U.S. debt, and I don't know, myself, anyways, and like, not original thoughts here, but I've been saying like this can't go on forever. But can it go on forever? I mean, the U.S. debt goes up by $1 trillion every 100 days or so. But we're looking at potentially higher inflation over the long term. And I mean, you look at the 40s, that's how the US got rid of their debt, right? Was just let inflation rip and devalue all their debt. Like, can't they just do the same thing again, and then we'll be stuck with central banking forever?
Yeah, you're right. When a nation has a lot of debt, there are a few ways that you can get out of it. One is that you can cut spending, so you have a greater surplus, and you use the surplus to pay down the debt. That's very hard because it's very hard to cut spending when you have these entrenched interest groups who benefit from that spending and won't let you do it. So the political process makes it hard to cut spending. Another thing you can do is default on the debt. Defaulting on the debt is something that the banking interests really don't like, because it has a huge negative effect on the financial sector, because people lose trust in the nation and in the financial institutions. So there's an interest group which really fights very hard. The third thing you can do is do what you said, Mark. You just inflate the money supply. And it really, what it does is it reduces the value of the debt. It makes it easier to pay debt. If you have $1 million in debt and the money supply is, let's say $1 trillion, if you double the money supply, that it becomes easier to pay down that $1 million in debt because there's just more money floating around. So governments have this very strong tendency, because it's politically difficult to do the other two things, to cut spending or to default, to inflate the money supply. And what that means is you might get a Bitcoin standard just through the inevitable fact that people don't want their money to lose value. And so they're looking for alternatives. When you see inflation happening, what do? You look around, you say, what do I put my money in to protect against inflation? And unfortunately, it creates this kind of gambling mindset where people are looking for, penny stocks, and they invest in GameStop and
we've chosen real estate for that reason, right? If I can buy a property that the government just can't produce more of at will, and I can buy it using debt, that goes down in value.
Yep, real estate,
like you said,
is an
right?
exit that people have used historically over time to escape inflation, but you should be careful because real estate itself is not immune from bubbles. And maybe this has been a little bit less true in Canada than it was in the US, but we had a massive housing bubble in the US where there are many locations where the price of houses dropped 50 or more %. It's possible for that to happen anywhere on earth. In places like Canada and Australia. And I look at, markets in Canada like Vancouver, and I think, how can you sustain house prices like this? Like, how could you... People are essentially using real estate as a store of value, right? Because people in China are like, how do I get my money out to a country where if I need to escape, I have something that's valuable. And they look at places like Vancouver, and so they bid up the price of houses in Vancouver. And then people who live in that city are like, I can't afford to buy a house. I can't afford to rent a house. A lot of these people in China are buying houses and keeping them empty. And so you have these perverse kind of economic effects and political effects because of that. But eventually governments might say, hey, this doesn't make any sense politically anymore. The population is getting upset. So we're going to put a big tax on owning houses in this way. And then you can pop a housing bubble. Like Vancouver could easily pop based on government policy. So I would be really worried that doesn't have a fundamental underpinning. It's because of other weird, perverse economic incentives that people are piling into houses in places like Vancouver. And another downside is houses are very hard to transact in, right? Like if you want to move country, you can't pick your house up and move to France with your house.
House is not a good monetary instrument.
It is not. It's not liquid. It's hard to transmit. But on the other hand, I will agree, houses they're physically tangible and they can produce cash flow. So there is some value. I don't want to discount it. I come from a family of, my dad was a big real estate investor in Australia. So I have a lot of sympathy for that mindset. If you're worried about inflation, buy something tangible. I just think there's a much better investment if you're worried about inflation, and that's Bitcoin.
Yeah. So I just brought that up because you mentioned like the general population is feeling inflation, like they're feeling the effects, and they're looking for other alternatives other than holding dollars or things related to the dollar. And real estate allows you to tap into the debt. But so how does Bitcoin? Maybe we can jump into some of the technical stuff. Like, you guys are both smiling. I'm like, I just think our audience might not fully understand like the technical side of what actually happens behind the scenes under the hood of Bitcoin.
I think the technical side, my view is the technical side is less important. I mean, everyone, once they get interested enough, should do a deep dive on how Bitcoin works and why it's interesting.
Yeah.
But I think more interesting than the technical side is the monetary side. Like, why do people choose Bitcoin? Why would you put any money in Bitcoin? Because the difference between money, like gold and Bitcoin and dollars, is that money does not provide cash flow. It's not like traditional assets. It's not like stocks. Stocks produce dividends. It's not like bonds. Bonds produce interest. And it's not like real estate, which produces rent. Most people are able to wrap their heads around, why does a rental property have value? Because it produces a certain amount of rent, and you just put a multiplier on that, and that you get the value of the house. When you look at gold or Bitcoin, because they don't produce any cash flow, people are like, how do I value this thing? Like, what is the right price for a gold coin? What's the right price for Bitcoin? The way to think about it is that people value monetary goods like gold and Bitcoin because of their function as money, for use as a store of value, as a medium of exchange. And the price level of things like gold and Bitcoin is determined by people's adoption of these things as money, as a store of value or as a medium of exchange. And as that adoption grows, the value goes up. So there's no simple formula here to say, Bitcoin should have this price or that price because it produces cash flow. Its value is really a function of how many people have adopted it as money. And then the next question is, why do people adopt it as money? Well, it's a better money. And what are the attributes that people use to decide which money is better than other monies? And these attributes have been known for thousands of years, since the time of Aristotle. What makes for a good money? Divisibility. It should be easily divided so that you can use it in large or small transactions. Portability. You want to be able to carry your money around. That's a big important thing. Fungibility. Every unit of the money should be equivalent to every other unit. So gold is superior to diamonds as money because every unit of gold is equivalent to every other unit, right? Gold is irregular in shape and quality, so it's harder to transact in because you have to look at each one and like, is this a good one? Is this not a good one? But the most important thing, the most important attribute for a good form of money is scarcity, because what you want with money is something that you can keep your savings in and that cannot be debased. So sand is a very poor money, because if sand were money, we'd all go to the beach, we'd get our buckets and we would become rich. And actually everyone would become quite poor quickly because, you could just produce more money. So historically, this has been the most important attribute for why people chose various things as money through history, whether it was seashells or beads or gold, or now Bitcoin. And the thing about Bitcoin that makes it truly special is that it has an absolutely fixed supply. You have ultimate scarcity. You don't even have that with gold. That is, that there'll never be more than 21 million Bitcoins ever produced. And so that makes it a very attractive thing to, get one Bitcoin. If you're able to get one Bitcoin, there's only 21 million people on Earth, actually a lot less than that because we talked about some number of Bitcoins being lost. If you get one Bitcoin, and Bitcoin becomes money because it does have these attributes that make it good as money, then you have 1 on 21 million of the global wealth. That's a big, big number, right? So you have to believe a couple of things: that it has the attributes that make it good as money. That's why people choose it and adopt it as money. So for instance, like my dad moving gold over to India, right? He might say, hey, wait a second, I'm not going to take gold. I'm going to take Bitcoin because I can transport it much more easily. And so he's looking at the attributes and saying, this is better money for me to do what I want to do. As more people recognize this over time, your value is going to go up because the supply is completely fixed. Eventually, I believe Bitcoin will become the global reserve currency. That process will take a long time. I think it'll be, 2 to 5 decades before that happens. But once that happens, if you've gotten even like a fraction of a Bitcoin, you're going to be enormously wealthy. It's kind of like buying Manhattan for a quarter. Maybe you had the chance to do that 400 or 500 years ago, and eventually Manhattan became this very valuable place. It's that kind of idea that you have this thing that's going to be global money, and you have important fraction of it. So I try to encourage people. We're at this point where you still can get a meaningful part of a Bitcoin. Try and get there. Try and get to 1 Bitcoin. Maybe that's only a small fraction of your total portfolio, but if you get there and Bitcoin goes where I think it will, you will be very, very happy in 1, 2, 3 decades from now.
So you are still bullish.
I am still extremely. I'm more bullish now than I've ever been about Bitcoin, because the biggest risk to Bitcoin that I saw was a nation state attack. Because you mentioned this, Mark.
Okay.
Nation states have this big incentive to control the money supply. So why would they want to give that up? And the only thing I thought would protect Bitcoin from this is political capture, which means you have enough people who own Bitcoin that politicians begin pandering to those people. And I think this was the first year we saw that in a big way in the United States, where you look at the Bitcoin conference, you have a presidential candidate who has a very good shot at winning, actually, coming to the Bitcoin conference and pandering to this audience, saying, I want to do things that are friendly to Bitcoin. It's kind of like the equivalent of, the 401k retirement plan in the US. You guys probably have something equivalent. You could never get rid of it, right? Imagine if they said, we're banning 401ks and we're confiscating them. It's political suicide, so no one would ever do it. I thought Bitcoin would only be truly safe from nation-state attack when it got to enough political capture. And I think this is the year that's happened. And this is the year I feel like I've been more bullish about Bitcoin than I've ever been, because it's gotten that political cover now to become as big as it needs to become.
Right, because in your book a few years ago, you did outline some of the risks, and one of the questions I had for you was, are those risks still relevant? So this would kind of knock off one of those. Are there new risks that you maybe didn't think of in the book originally, or you're just knocking off your checklist as you see these events happen in history?
I wanted to be open about the risks. I think that was one of the reasons that my article and my book resonated with people, that I'm not a dishonest shill. I think that there are real risks to Bitcoin, and I wanted to spell them out to be as open as possible. There are things like protocol risks. Bitcoin's a technology, and maybe someone figures out that there's a big technological flaw in Bitcoin. But our confidence that is not going to happen grows over time, right? You've had the best computer scientists and hackers trying to break Bitcoin for well over a decade now. No one's been able to do it. So I think that risk is actually very, very small. I've always thought that nation-state attack was the most significant risk. I listed a bunch of other ones, but none of them to me compare to like the United States government, which is incredibly powerful, saying, we're going to destroy Bitcoin, we're going to ban it, we're going to go after it in various ways, make it illegal to own. If that happened, I think it would be very tough for Bitcoin to continue to become more valuable. So I think the fact that politicians are now coming around to supporting Bitcoin, and a lot of them own Bitcoin. There are several members of Congress now who actually own Bitcoin and have it as part of their savings. That gives Bitcoin a lot of political cover. And I think that's going to increase actually very substantially over the next 2 to 3 years as we have these products like the ETFs, right? Now everyone can own Bitcoin very easily. You can go to your brokerage account, and just as easily as buying Apple stock or Microsoft, you can buy Bitcoin. And so the audience of people who are going to have Bitcoin exposure is I think it's going to grow by an order of magnitude over the next 5 years.
So, okay, here's something I've been pondering lately, and I think Jeff Booth and George Gammon have been arguing about it a little bit too. You talk in your book, and sorry, I'm just looking at the book, and I see you got Cynthia Lummis has given it an endorsement. She's a United States Senator for Wyoming. She's a big proponent of Bitcoin, so that just bolsters what you're saying. But rehypothecation. So now we've got, like BlackRock and these guys are like, Bitcoin and Vanguard and Fidelity, all these guys are recommending Bitcoin to their customers. And, to me, I'm just like, like it's not just because it's a good investment. I know sure it is, but like there's got to be something else going on. And, you look at the US dollar and euro dollars, and nobody actually knows how many euro dollars there actually are out there. What is the risk of something like that happening with Bitcoin? And I mean, that in itself would not destroy Bitcoin, but it would make a Bitcoin standard, I don't know, to me, like almost pointless, or a similar system of oppression as we have with fiat dollars today. Like, do you think there's a risk of that happening?
Can we explain rehypothecation?
Well, I mean, like derivatives and stuff like that, right? Where you can make other financial instruments based on Bitcoin, like our stock market. You have calls and puts and then a whole bunch of complicated stuff that I don't understand and other people don't, but it's all, well, even like the mortgage-backed paper, right, in 2008, all this stuff.
Yeah.
Whatever you can imagine, multiply that by 100.
Yeah.
Can that happen with Bitcoin?
It's a legitimate concern. I actually mentioned that in my book, and I mentioned that rehypothecation is really just a financial institution holding Bitcoin for people, but actually not holding it for them and lending it out to someone else so that they can profit based on getting some value back on those loans. And then perhaps the next institution that borrowed it lends it again, and it gets lent over and over and over again. And this can make a financial system brittle if the loan standards are really low. And what happens is you get these moments of crisis where one domino falls and then it knocks all the other dominoes over. And this happened in 2022, when all of these companies that were in the space, Celsius and Voyager and BlockFi and Genesis and FTX, they all collapsed at the same time because they were all doing this rehypothecation. So I disagree a little bit, because I do think there is a place for a financial system to be built on top of Bitcoin, and that lending by itself is not harmful, but lending requires careful oversight, careful risk management, and perhaps this kind of sounds crazy as a libertarian to say this, some amount of regulation where you don't have people like Sam Bankman-Fried, who is basically stealing his customers' money and using it, both to lend to his own hedge fund. He was giving it to Alameda Capital and using it to win political influence. He was taking people's deposits, which they thought was a deposit and they could withdraw whenever they wanted. And he was using that to buy political influence in United States elections. Absolutely criminal. So some amount of oversight is necessary. I won't say that lending by itself is harmful. Rehypothecation is just lending. Because some lending is beneficial. What you're doing is you're lending to someone who otherwise would not be able to start a business. And what lending is doing is it's bringing production from the future into the present. You're giving people capital to build things.
Now you're starting to sound like our prime minister.
Yeah. I hope that's a very dangerous thing to be accused of.
Yeah. Sorry.
But I think it's more dangerous. I will agree with you, Mark, but I think there is a place for loans in society. I do think that capitalism can thrive, and you can have greater production with lending that's well regulated and isn't, crazy, irresponsible, or criminal. So there is a good middle ground here, but it is a valid concern to think, hey, if this rehypothecation gets out of control, then the whole system is much more brittle. Then you get things like the 2008 financial crisis. You get, the crypto crash of 2022. So you're playing with fire a little bit. Totally legitimate to worry about that.
Yeah. Well, it is interesting that we went through this stuff in 2022, and Bitcoin's still around and the price is still up, and it's resilient, if nothing else. Right. So, I think exactly. that's certainly a bigger conversation. You do a whole series on that, maybe the oversight of Bitcoin Oversight Committee. Maybe you could be on it. Well, that's
an important point. I just want to emphasize that there's a big difference between Bitcoin, the asset, and the companies that operate in the space and provide services around Bitcoin. It's like the difference between gold as an asset, like physical gold, and gold miners as companies. Like, the two things are not the same thing. Like, investing in a gold miner is not the same thing as investing in gold. It's unfortunate that the companies in the space, a lot of them have been extremely irresponsible or malfeasant or criminal, and they do deserve stronger regulation because of the way they've behaved. But that should not reflect on the underlying asset, because Bitcoin itself is a very special thing. We just need, more responsible entrepreneurs, and we need maybe better regulation to make sure that they don't steal people's money.
Well, it's interesting. I think we got to wrap up because you got to get going, Vijay. But you mentioned the 19th century in the United States, and I'm just thinking of railroads and all these things that were getting built, and just these crazy stories about these corrupt railroad owners and companies. But eventually it got there. It was the Wild West for a while, and I feel like we're maybe in the teenage years of Bitcoin, but part of the process, I think.
That's a great analogy. Yeah, it was the Wild West, and in many ways it was corrupt and it was painful, and It wasn't ideal, but capitalism is never ideal. It's a messy process. And the extent that we have more freedom is the same extent to which we all benefit and our standard of living goes up and we become wealthy as a society. So I hope Bitcoin sort of ushers in a new golden age for not just the US economy, but the world economy.
So if you had 30 seconds to tell someone who thinks they've already missed the boat on Bitcoin, what would you say? You say, Vijay, I missed the boat. It's way too much. Yeah.
I would say that everyone who buys
Is it still worth looking into?
Yeah, everyone who buys Bitcoin has the feeling that they're late. And that was true for people who bought it $100. They looked at their friends who had bought it $1. It's true for people who bought it $1,000, who looked back and said, well, it used to be, $100. Bitcoin, the way to look at it is it's a new form of money that's growing in adoption. And where are we on the adoption curve? We are extremely early. Maybe 2 or 3%, to be generous, of the world's population owns Bitcoin. We have a long, long way to go before we have full global adoption. And another way to think of it when you're thinking about is the price too high? You should think about it in terms of what percentage of your portfolio do you feel comfortable having in Bitcoin? Maybe it's only 1%. That's totally fine. I think the only number that doesn't make sense is 0. You have to have some exposure to this because this has some chance, and I think a much greater chance today, of becoming global money. Just look at the political winds, look at the economic system, look at the ability to access Bitcoin through things like the ETFs. Bitcoin has become so de-risked from where it was even 3 or 4 years ago that I really think you have to have some exposure in your portfolio to Bitcoin. Find what that number is to you. Maybe it starts at 1%, you become more comfortable, you understand it more, and it gets up to 5%. Just make sure it's not 0. 0 is the wrong number.
All right.
Wow, that's
Good.
great, Vijay. 0 is the wrong number. Well, maybe that'll be the title of the podcast.
Didn't Breedlove write something about the number 0 in Bitcoin? But maybe.
So Vijay, where can people find you? Where can people find, I don't know, do you want to be found, but where can they find your book?
Well, you can find...
Where can they find your laptop that you lost 10 years ago?
It's somewhere in Minnesota. If you find that laptop, I will give you some large fraction of the Bitcoin on there. You can find me on Twitter. I'm on Twitter at real_Vijay at Twitter. And or X now, I guess. And I respond to messages. If you have any questions about Bitcoin, feel free to send me a message. I always try and respond to everyone. Love talking about Bitcoin with anyone, which is how I got connected with you guys, and really glad I did. So yeah, find me there, or if you're in Seattle, you can shoot me a message, and maybe you can grab a coffee and talk about Bitcoin.
Yeah, grab a copy of the Bullish Case for Bitcoin right there. Forward by Michael Saylor, which is kind of cool too. So
yeah. Great. Well,
yeah, we'll link to all your stuff in the show notes as well, so people can know where to find you.
Appreciate it. Thank you, guys.
Yeah. So yeah, Vijay, thank you again so much for being with us. We got a lot out of this. I know our audience will as well. And until next time, folks.
Steward your wealth wisely.